want to start by welcoming you, and I do hope that you enjoy what we have on offer this evening. Before we start the official program, I would like to extend the university's deepest concern and sympathy to our brothers and sisters throughout the Eastern Caribbean and beyond, who have suffered and who will continue to suffer the ravages wrought by climate change. This has indeed been a season of unprecedented destruction, and UWI stands with our brothers and sisters throughout the Caribbean in this moment of profound loss and devastation. I want to extend, and I know normally we conclude a program with some appreciations, but indulge me for a moment. But I want to really extend my appreciation to a number of persons, namely PVCs and principals of the Cave Hill campus and Open Campus, Professor Barito and Dr. Longsworth, Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, Deputy Dean Outreach, Dr. Wendy Grenade, who is with us here today. But most importantly, I would like to acknowledge the stellar work done by the Open Campus St. Lucia site, and in particular, Leslie Crane Michel, who has done tremendous amount of groundwork for us, which shows in the number of persons in the audience today. Our reality is that without the work undertaken by Leslie, we would be scrambling. So as William Arthur Ward, American writer, said, and I quote, "Feeling gratitude and not expressing it is like wrapping a present and not giving it." Thank you, Leslie. So again, even while we ponder the recent events in the Caribbean, North and South America, it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to the inaugural Eastern Caribbean Lecture, which will be delivered by our distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Lennox Honychurch. I think many of you are familiar with the work of Dr. Honychurch. Dr. Honychurch graciously agreed to be with us as we focus exclusively on the Eastern Caribbean. We were adamant that a citizen of the Eastern Caribbean was the most qualified individual to deliver the inaugural address, and it was quickly agreed that Dr. Honychurch fulfilled all our criteria. So it is a pleasure to be with you today, if only to have a chance of listening to Dr. Honychurch, but quite naturally, it is, after all, St. Lucia, my home always. So I'm always happy to be here. But to those who came here as our guests, UWI Cave Hill campus and the Open Campus extend our appreciation and our gratitude. As we look towards the 70th anniversary of the University of the West Indies, as in 2018, the Eastern Caribbean will host a number of events as we focus on critical aspects of governance in the Caribbean. Now I want you to permit me, and again bear with me for just a moment, as I quote Marcus Aurelius. I'm very mindful of the fact that the statement that he made was followed almost quickly by his untimely death, but nonetheless I think is very appropriate for what we intend to do over the next few years. And I quote, "For nothing is so productive of elevation of mind as to be able to examine methodically and candidly every object presented in life, and always to look at things to see at the same time what kind of world this is, and what use everything performs in it, and what value everything has in relation to the whole, and what with reference to the individual, what each thing is, of what it is composed, and how long it is in the nature of this thing to endure." No one can say that this is the best of time, for whether we speak of the performance of political and economic institutions, society as a whole, the increasing levels of crime and criminality, violence of all forms, and climate change, this is a moment of tremendous change, trepidation, and fear. In such an environment, I believe it is important to pause before we move forward, and so some level of introspection is critical. And so I sincerely believe that as we take stock of where we are, the difficulties of governance in this age of uncertainty, turbulence, and isolationism, I think that Marcus Aurelius' statement is a fitting introduction to what we hope will be a series of interactions within the Eastern Caribbean, which we anticipate will capture the essence of the regional problematic and the hopes for the future. And who best to help us in this critical moment of introspection but a former journalist, a historian, an anthropologist, an artist, a parliamentarian, a humanist, and a social commentator. We believe that, beginning with our guest speaker this evening, that whilst it may be a stretch to say that through our proposed engagements throughout the Eastern Caribbean, we will be able to offer the public eternal truths and open sesame that will unlock the doors to utopia. Nonetheless, through all our guest speakers, with Lennox being the first, we hope that we will be able to offer you a reasoned opinion, though a very personal and intimate interpretation of what kind of society, economy, and polity we have, and the part that we can all play to better all aspects of our economy, society, and politics. I do not believe that anyone will offer the opinions and assessments as the ultimate truth, but we do hope that our efforts in the Eastern Caribbean, beginning with Dr. Honychurch, will be of mutual assistance, pointing the way to fruitful possibilities for the future. Given the state of the world today, which is increasingly marked, as I said before, by intolerance, whether ideological, nationalist, and so on, it's important that we have an open mind. For a closed mind is dangerous. It ensures that we accept and adopt certain viewpoints uncritically without understanding the historical background, the context, the universality, and in the process, that it condemns us. We hope that the spirit which has inspired this lecture and the others to come across the Eastern Caribbean will therefore meet with your approval. We really sincerely hope so.
My task tonight is indeed a pleasant and benign one. It is one of those tasks where you can please everyone and certainly not run afoul of the allegedly powerful and their devotees and surrogates. Tonight, I leave all the academic occupational risks and hazards to Dr. Lennox Honychurch. I have been asked simply to offer welcome remarks and greetings on behalf of the UWI Open Campus. I do this, of course, with much pride in light of our campus's intellectual patrimony. Pro-Vice Chancellor and Principal Dr. Luce Longsworth and my colleagues of the Open Campus leadership team have asked me to convey their best wishes to Dr. Honychurch, the organizers, that is the Faculty of Social Sciences, KVIL, in collaboration with the Open Campus. The St. Lucia site, which I include in the latter, but I must single out, sponsors and indeed you, our wonderful audience and the media, for successful and exciting inaugural lecture in the Eastern Caribbean Public Lecture Series. I also bring warm greetings from our Open Campus staff, students, and the entire campus across the region. It is very special, it's a very special pleasure for me to represent these good people at this exciting event of intellectual stimulation. Even as we enjoy tonight, I beg you to reflect on our not so lucky brothers and sisters who suffer in the British Virgin Islands, Anguilla, Barbuda, Turks and Caicos Islands, St. Martin, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, Florida, Houston, Texas, and all the places that have been badly impacted by the recent natural hazards, including hurricanes Irma and Harvey. The UWI Open Campus is truly pleased to be intimately associated with this important outreach activity, and to be certain, as our history, tradition, and foundation will unambiguously demonstrate, we are at home with such events. The Open Campus, which was officially launched in 2008, has evolved from its earlier UWI departments, including the Extramural Department, the School of Continuing Studies, the UWI Distance Education Center, and the Tertiary Level Institutions Unit. Former colleagues Fergus, Bernard, and Suarez, in their book, Breaking Down the Walls, An Evolution of the Extramural Department, the University of the West Indies, 1947 to 2000, remind us rather affectionately, and not with a little nostalgia, that the sites, formerly university centers as they were called, were more than the establishment of physical infrastructure. They represented the presence and permanence of the UWI and the planting of stakes in its distant communities. They would become a focal point for community activities of a cultural, economic, and social nature, and a forum for consultation in connection with local problems, education, agriculture, engineering, and social affairs. We therefore view this activity as an inescapable part of our programming, as well as our objective of meeting people where they are. We are especially emboldened by our Vice Chancellor's constant reminder to us, which is possible to argue, has been an abiding part of his own academic, intellectual demeanor, that we are and must abet our university's role as an activist university. I believe that Sir Hilary intended, therefore, for the UWI to act on behalf of Caribbean people and diaspora in a way that will ensure their physical, mental, and psychosomatic wellness and well-being. I also believe that Sir Hilary intended that we conduct such activity with integrity and honesty, our guide being what we knew to be true and what was properly researched, whether qualitatively or quantitatively, well-informed and intentioned, not what the powerful felt or wanted as their agenda. Indeed, the Vice-Chancellor made the poignant argument in delivering a post-US presidential election analysis on the implications of the Caribbean on November 9th, 2016, at the University of the West Indies regional headquarters. And so Hilary said, in all our democracies in the modern world, a fundamental value is that you must speak truth to power. That leadership is about people, as citizens, speaking truth to power. But what we have seen is the speaking of lies to the powerless. So the philosophy is turned upside down, Sir Hilary says. The powerful speak lies to the powerless every day, and the powerless believe the lies. This is really the issue that is leaving people thinking, how is democracy going to work when the powerful just tell lies every day to the powerless, and the powerless just accept those lies as truth, unquote. Frankly, I am personally invigorated by this new university order, elaborated and specified by the Vice-Chancellor. And indeed, I assure Dr. Wendy Grenade and her powerful team, who've worked very hard to bring this initiative to fruition, that its aims coincide with our university's stated thrust. Hence, it will contribute to intellectual debates on issues of critical importance to the Eastern Caribbean and strengthen the visibility and impact of the UE in the Eastern Caribbean. In that regard, and speaking of truth, let me say without fear of contradiction that Open Campus St. Lucia is appropriately chosen for the launch of the inaugural Eastern Caribbean Public Lecture Series. It is one of our most dynamic and forward-looking sites, led by a brave, courageous, and diligent leader, Dr. Veronica Simon, and her magnificent team, who are practically omnipresent in the St. Lucia society. I would like you to give them a round of applause. It is truly gratifying to ponder the tremendous work of the Open Campus St. Lucia, such as, inter alia, the St. Lucia Colloquy, the annual Lady Marilyn Flozak Memorial Lecture, and last year's lecture was entitled, Show Me Your Skin and I'll Tell You Who You Are, and the many other lectures throughout the year, and the St. Lucia Country Conference. We're also proud of our various outreach activities, including public lectures and country conferences mounted by our open campus sites in other OECS countries. I will not specifically detail them here, but again, I am very excited that this series throughout the Eastern Caribbean accomplish just what I envisage: intellectual debate in the public domain, rather than hidden in academic journals, or biblically speaking, hidden under bushel, and the strengthening of relations between the open campus and our good colleagues at the Cave Hill campus. The recent public lecture in St. Vincent in August 2017 by your own Dr. Tennyson S.D. Joseph, entitled Any Cook Can Govern, Amen. Plato, Donald Trump, Amen. And the Rise of Caribbean Business Politicians, will be spoken about for a long time. And Dr. Wendy Grenade's own lecture in Dominica on the occasion of the 10th Dame Eugenia Charles Memorial Lecture in November 2015 on the topic Unleashing the Spirit of Overcoming provides another fine example of solid public non-formal education, underscoring the depth of academic talent at the UWI. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight will be great too. I promise you, Dr. Lennox Honychurch is known for his substance, research, and, as if that were not enough, delivering in a passionate and energetic style. He takes you along with him, literally. His humility, of course, is what strikes you. He was actually surprised. He volunteered to me that he received from the UE an honorary doctorate in laws as opposed to letters. I assured him that the UWI knew far more about his early political engagement than he was prepared to divulge. Dr. Honychurch, we at the UWI know everything, and then some. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, I offer a warm welcome to the Open Campus and Open Campus St. Lucia in particular. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride. We know you had choice in terms of where you would be tonight, but you made the right decision, and you are here. Great is the University of the West Indies, and it shall prevail.
As chair of the planning committee, I wish to take this opportunity to briefly explain the genesis of this public lecture series. Now, Dr. Justin Robinson, the dean of the faculty, he gave me a mandate in my capacity as deputy dean for outreach. And he said, Wendy, you need to deepen our engagement with the Eastern Caribbean. And part of this mandate included strengthening ties with the OECS Commission and other regional and sub-regional institutions, and collaborating closely with the Open Campus to expand the reach and impact of the UWI in the Eastern Caribbean. Dr. Robinson's vision is part of a wider UWI trust to revitalize Caribbean development. As the University of the West Indies, we are committed to strengthening our internal operations, expanding our international reach, and deepening our commitment to regional development. In fact, the UWI is currently implementing a new strategic plan that has 3 interrelated pillars: access, alignment, and agility. This AAA strategy is intended to locate the university at the cutting edge of a higher education into the 21st century and beyond. It is within this university-wide context that we are here this evening. The Cave Hill campus has always been at home in the Eastern Caribbean. We are building on a tradition of outreach, partnership, and collective effort. I wish to thank Dr. Luz Longsworth, Pro-Vice Chancellor and Principal of the Open Campus, for partnering with us in this endeavor. This event required extensive planning over distance, and the planning team comprised colleagues from the Open and Cave Hill campuses. Ms. Gracelyn Cassell, head of the Open Campus Montserrat, Mrs. Leslie Crane Mitchell, marketing officer, the Open Campus here in St. Lucia, Mrs. Deborah Dalrymple, head of the Open Campus St. Vincent and the Grenadines site, Mr. Ronnie Daniel, marketing officer of the Open Campus St. Vincent and the Grenadines site, and from Cave Hill, Mrs. Cynthia Barra-Giles, senior lecturer as our chair this evening, and Mr. Jeremy Stevens from the Department of Economics. Now, it was such a pleasure working with this team. I wish to thank them all for their commitment to the process. For several months, we planned using Skype, and at times the technology was not very favorable, but we had to persevere. And this collaboration, in fact, exemplifies the concept of one UWI, collective effort for collective purpose. As chair of the planning committee, I wish to thank Dr. Honychurch for readily agreeing to deliver this inaugural address. Welcome, Dr. Honychurch. I look forward to what I am sure will be an enlightening and inspirational lecture. And welcome to all of you. Do have an enjoyable and enriching experience here this evening, and I thank you.
Dame Paulette Louise, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to be here, as usual, in St. Lucia, and particularly honored to deliver this first inaugural lecture here for UE. And I chose this subject of the OECS. That is because this year, the majority of members, states of the OECS, gained internal self-government in 1967, 50 years ago this year. The lecture looks at what has been achieved during that period and assesses the options for the future. What I will be using are several historical anniversaries to show how the administrative grouping and constitution of the island nations, which now make up the OECS, were haphazardly invented in an attempt to deal with the various periods of crisis and colonial management. These include the creation of early sub-regional groupings such as the Leeward Islands, the Windward Islands, the piecing together of the Federation of the West Indies, attempts at fashioning a union of the little eight that were left over after its collapse, the fabrication of the associated statehood with Britain, and eventual independence. Next year will mark the 180 years since full emancipation, as it was called, of the enslaved people in the British colonies, and the start of a process of imagining a new society out of the shattered remnants of their ancestral experience. But for another 100 years, conditions hardly changed in terms of infrastructure, trade, labor, and social services, until the working class of the region rose up in the 1930s to demand new systems that would offer them a better life. As a result of this, there is another anniversary in 2018, observing the 80 years since the arrival of the Moyne Commission in 1938 to investigate the deplorable conditions and to make recommendations which transformed the Eastern Caribbean in significant ways. Not least was the achievement of universal adult suffrage, which led to the transformation of politics that in turn heralded greater advances in self-government. Also next year will be the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War. That marks the springboard of Caribbean nationalism and West Indian identity, when returning soldiers from that so-called Great War began to question the validity of empire. Their contribution to the nationalist movement will be considered. I will draw on my personal experience as a negotiator for Dominica's independence in the 1970s to show that Britain was only too keen to divest herself of her former colonies so as to clear the way for her deeper involvement in Europe. The irony of Britain's current move, some 40 years later, to exit the European Union and its efforts to recultivate closer links with the Commonwealth, including the states of the Eastern Caribbean, should be noted as an ironic move. In closing, I look at the future and consider the options on the way forward. I argue that this group of small island states faces a precarious globalized world. We are dominated not just by metropolitan governments engineering political advantage, but also by powerful neoliberalist corporations and individual oligarchs attempting to manipulate the conditions of investment and control of our governments for our respective islands to their advantage, regardless of the social or ecological fallout. The manner in which our leaders respond to this challenge is the theme of my concluding remarks. Let me first analyze the title. Eric Hobsbawm, the Marxist historian, has this concept of invented tradition. The nation as an invented tradition, and I quote, he says, "The nation, with its associated phenomena, nationalism, the nation state, national symbols, histories, and the rest, all rest on the exercises of social engineering, which are often deliberate and always innovative. These very concepts themselves must include a contracted or invented component. The national component cannot be adequately investigated without careful attention to the invention of tradition." So essentially, as nation states, and in what I participated when we were devising a constitution for Dominica, and other leaders throughout the Eastern Caribbean were devising independence constitutions for themselves, we were in effect inventing nations. And this invention then had to be passed on to the citizens of those nations in imagined communities. And it is the anthropologist Benedict Anderson who proposes that, and I quote, "The definition of a nation is an imagined political community. It is imagined because the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them. Yet in the minds of each, there is the image of their communion. For the citizens of St. Lucia, for instance, nous tous ces gens sont ici. And then for Vincentians, we are all Vincentians. In Dominica, nous tous ces Dominici." Now, this imagination is fed by anthems, flags, coat of arms, and stories of heroes and heroines of nationhood. Our myths were different when we were colonies. We imagined England. We imagined Queen Victoria. We saw ourselves as children of a vast empire, and the stories that went with it placed us in that community of desperate territories across the globe. As we moved to self-government, we had to suddenly alter the narrative, change the mindset, and imagine something new. For some people, steeped from childhood in the other previous story, this was a difficult transformation to imagine making. So this is the main theme of the talk, the fact that as Caribbean people, and I'm particularly addressing this to the OECS, is that we have been over time going through various phases of having to imagine ourselves as something else. And it has been, in a way, a psychologically taxing exercise that we have done. So I'm dividing this lecture into 3 sections. First, how did this grouping of former colonies come about? Second, the invention of the various constitutions over time, with the various powers which saw the best regulations and the most efficient administration of people that had emerged since the Treaty of Paris for some of us in 1763, and more so after full emancipation in 1838, and the regaining of independence in the 1970s and early 1980s. I say the regaining of independence. We don't often say that. It's not part of our narrative. But let us understand that prior to 1500, prior to the late 1400s, we were independent. So when we gain independence on the 3rd of November, 1978, or whichever date any of us in any of these OECS states celebrate as our independence, we are regaining independence. We are not just gaining it for the first time. Because what in essence we are doing if we don't say that is we are negating the whole Kalinago presence and their activity prior to being taken over by various European states. I say regaining because our islands were independent for at least a couple of thousand years prior to the advent of European colonization and after the coming of Columbus and European colonization. Remember, Christopher Columbus never landed on any OECS state. He passed by, he named some, others he may have seen, as in the case of St. Lucia when he was landing on Martinique, and he may have seen Grenada when he was approaching Trinidad, and St. Vincent remains a mystery. There are two significant periods in our history that is often sidelined, and I want to emphasize these tonight. First, that is that period from the time of Columbus's adventure when he stumbled upon these islands, and this was a period that lasted for some 150 to 200 years, depending on which colony and which part of the Eastern Caribbean you were on. So this was a period, and let us remember that although the effects of Spanish colonization did affect us down the Lesser Antilles in the 1500s, that actual occupation by European powers did not take full effect until the English and French colonization of St. Kitts in 1625 and the eventual occupation of Dominica and St. Vincent by the British in 1763. But this period of Kalinago survival has largely been ignored, and yet we should revisit it if we want to fully understand our relationship to these, our island homes, and that's what I'll be doing in a moment. The other important period that does not get detailed attention that it should, although it gets more attention than the first one that I talked about, is that what I call the century of stagnation. That is the time between full emancipation in 1838 to the working class uprisings of the 1930s that climaxes with the arrival of the Moyne Commission in 1938. That is the anniversary which we will be observing next year. And the effects of it, as I said, will be very, and are very marked. We still live with some of the results of those Moyne Commissions. We use them every day, be it the airports all along our islands, the ports and parts of the ports, hospitals, clinics, etc. This is the Indigenous Union. This is the reimagination of the territory that was occupied by the Kalinago people. And even after Columbus had come and given his various names, Dominica, Dies Dominica for the Day of our Lord, and Marie-Galante for the flagship, and Guadeloupe for where he had prayed before he left Cadiz, etc. All of these names were names that the minds of the Kalinago people went on long after Columbus had even died, because these are collected by missionaries in the 1650s, 1640s. And the indigenous people were still using those names because, of course, they had not been familiar with the European map to change them. And those persons who hung on in various places were able to pass on this information. Their territory, their zone, was essentially what is today the Windward and a bit of the Leeward Islands. And they had a very strong relationship with South America. But there was this free movement of people from one part of the Eastern Caribbean to the other. We talk about free movement today, but God knows we have to fill out so many forms before we even land in any territory. Even if we are citizens of that territory, it's quite amazing. And I often wonder, have we caught up with the technology? I first started zipping back and forth through the islands and filling out these forms when I was 10 years old back in the early 1960s. And I'm still filling out these forms, although we now have computerized screening of our passports. The passports should have all the information which are on computers. And there we are filling out these forms, which I've been doing for the last 50 or so years. It's quite amazing. And the Kalinago youth in Dominica, made a joke to me the other day when they were held up in Marie-Galante because they did not have passage. They told the gendarmes, but you know, we have been coming back and forth here for thousands of years. What are you doing holding us up, asking us for our identity? The other thing that we have lost, because we have lost the knowledge, is the knowledge of the relationship to the land. And the sad thing, of course, is that with colonization, all of this was swept away. And here, when you recompose the Kalinago vision of these islands, you can see the pattern that we have lost. That, you know, the sun is the furthest south on the 21st of December. And actually, Robert DeVoe here in St. Lucia explained to me how it was identified for people by the way the sun set on certain days of the year against the pitons. So when it was setting against the piton, the Gros Piton, it would be the furthest south, and when it was setting against the Petit Piton, it would be the furthest north. And they would know that the rainy season is going to start, and halfway through the rainy season in September is the height of the hurricane season, so you've got to have your cassava and your yams and your sweet potato in the ground before that period comes along. We have forgotten all of this because it has been swept from our consciousness. And the making of stone tools, and I'm going to be dealing with this, and you will think it's quite peculiar that I should relate this to the 21st century. But I'm going to, because here were these individuals, and you can go to their sites all over St. Lucia and St. Vincent and Dominica, where you see the indentations in the rocks, and you realize how long it took to make a stone axe. And when people come along and offer you a metal axe and persuade you to part with land for the new metal axe and the cutlass and the scissors and maybe a little mirror here and there, you will understand the temptation. Just as when the big moneyed oligarchs come in the 21st century and ask for huge chunks of your land so that they will benefit at your expense, and your people will lose part of their birthright to be able to occupy those zones for massive developments of one kind or another. So I am relating it to the indigenous world, the difficult temptation to save yourself from making an axe that you had to sit down for 3 weeks rubbing against the stone, to be handed this piece of cast iron that could be sharpened at any time and would not break. The temptation to get the better things of life in the 21st century in relation to parting with what your country has. So, you know, it has been an ongoing experience. And sure enough, that 200 years is a fascinating period. And if we could only explore, I did part of my thesis on it, and I've done a paper, for instance. This scene down at the bottom happens at Vieux Fort, where Chief Anthony has to deal with arrival of English settlers, and a whole set of relationships are broken. This is the fight that takes place on the beach at Vieux Fort. And Chief Anthony is essentially in control of that section of St. Lucia, of Hiwanora. And these are the kinds of things that leaders of the current OECS are having to deal with in a different form indeed, but they are having to deal with them nonetheless. And so that whole 150, 200-year-old period is one that is very instructive to us. If we put together the names of the chiefs, you know, in Dominica, we have about 6 or 7 of them in different parts. Calamiena and others. Calamiena is up in the north, in Itassi, and others in the south, and chiefs here, chiefs in St. Vincent, and what they had to go through and negotiate. It is not the history that we traditionally learn where you jump from Columbus right in to British or French settlement. There's this whole period which has actually formed our reality. We became, when colonization eventually did take place, these pawns in the power game. we essentially, as small islands, were very much like those pieces on a chessboard or drafts on a drafts board. And we were shifted around depending on who won which war where and which treaty was signed in which castle. Usually a French castle, Versailles, Paris, Aix-la-Chapelle. And we shifted across in this way, depending on sometimes the passage of the wind in, achieving a victory, let us say, at the Battle of the Saints, and the power play of sugar, and the claims related to various islands, related to countries, related to their various national powers. And so, in this part of the world, following the Treaty of Paris in 1763, we became this southern Caribbean colony, which included Dominica, St. Vincent, Grenada, Tobago. We were managed from Tobago. St. George's was our capital. But within short years, within less than 10 years, the colony was broken apart, and we all had our individual governments. So not for the last time was an attempt at unity broken up. And of course, St. Lucia flitted in and out of that union, depending on whether it was caught by the French or not. And therefore, the characteristic of these islands, Dominica, St. Lucia particularly, Grenada, is of a particular way today. A senior member of the CCJ, we were having a discussion the other day and said, in all my period working in the Supreme Court, I have noticed that the Leeward Islands people have a different characteristic from the Windward Islands people. What do you think it is? And I said, well, if you take the Leeward Islands, they essentially were all mainly controlled full-time by the British, and they had the Protestant faith, whether it was the Church of England, nominally the Church of the government, the Church of the state, and later on the Moravians and the Methodists and whatever. And there's a certain pattern because religion is also a philosophy. So you will find, in Antigua and St. Kitts and Nevis, there's an attitude of God only helps those who help themselves. And the way in which they deliver their speeches and all that is very much like the minister of a Methodist church. When you come down here to the Windward Islands, it's more, ça pour faire, ça c'est affaire bon Dieu, because of the Roman Catholic influence, and the changes that have taken place even in our national concepts of being French, the fact that many of us are bilingual and we have slipping from one language to the next, there is a character variation in that regard. So when we talk about the OECS, and I don't know if the director has to deal with this also from time to time, when he deals with Leeward Islanders as opposed to Windward Islanders, there are roots in this. There's a reality in this difference that we do have. And then we have this period which we all know about. This is a period that we focus on the plantations. All O-level students love plantation questions because it's so nice and easy. Slavery, crushing sugar, whatever. It gets a little more complex if you go before then, and of course post-emancipation is even more complex again. But the fact is that all of our islands were just sites for industrial agriculture and human energy on a massive scale. That you were industrializing human energy to the breaking point, to satisfy mercantile profits, bereft of any social conscience. Now, this is what I fear for in the 21st century, with all of these oligarchs and neoliberalists, in that they do not care what the social fallout is of these little territories. What they care about is the profits of their large-scale investments, which are not controlled by any governments. This is not an issue of being colonized by a British government or a French government or whatever. Neoliberalism in the world today allows people to move so freely and move their money so freely that once they control these independent island states and control their leaders, they are able to do almost whatever they want. And so we have to learn these lessons. We have to be cognizant of them so that we don't repeat repeat the mistakes which have been made. Certainly people will say, oh, well, slavery is illegal. Certainly it's not going to be slavery. It's going to be more the Bob Marley kind of slavery, the mental slavery, and the slavery of occupation. You're going to argue, for instance, that your GDP and your GNP is so wonderful and high, but what about the housing situation of your people? All these people who are working in the wonderful hotels, where are they living? In the little narrow squatter settlements up in the ravines, because all the other land has been taken for middle class and upper middle class and foreign housing. There was a wonderful film done recently about the north coast of Jamaica and these effects. When we are making these decisions, we must think of the quality of life. It's not all GDP and GNP and statistics. What is the quality of life of our people in this regard? If the pressure builds up, where people feel that they have been badly done by, or that these situations are exploiting them, they will revolt. We are peaceful and quiet now because we have so many bills and so many commitments that we are fearful of revolting. We used to revolt in the 1970s, but that's when we were free and easy people and we didn't have all these big expenses on our back. But now, the responsibilities of things like parenthood and mortgages and loans and various other things make us think twice about going out into the street and demonstrating about whatever we are feeling wronged about. And so, the same. In all of our islands, and these of course are the more mountainous islands, another comparative between the flatter, more accessible Leeward Islands. It was down in these islands, particularly in the 1790s, Grenada with Fedon and his revolt going on there, St. Vincent and the Garifuna Black Caribs, who eventually were picked up, most of them, and sent to the islands of Rautan off Honduras, and then eventually moved to southern Belize. St. Lucia with the so-called Brigands' Wars that during the French Revolution, and in Dominica with the Maroons and the invasion by the French. So we see these periods of activity within our islands that really do impact on our memories today, if we do have those memories and if we are alert to those realities. And then we move to the slave emancipation. Now this was, let us understand, in phases. And what is interesting happening in that early part of the 19th century is a tug of war between the British power and planter power. It was rather, in a way, like the southern USA and the north. Although we were islands, so therefore the planters could not revolt in the same way that the southerners did. They were dependent on the Royal Navy, etc. But when you read the documents, the planter assemblies of our islands were thinking very much the same way as the south of the US. And by that time, by the time we get in particularly into the 1817, 1822, these registration laws and amelioration acts were being pushed by a new breed of parliamentarian in Britain. And certainly in 1834, there had been the Reform Act in Britain. There had been a reformed parliament. The British government had opened voting to a larger number of people. And the whole business of slavery and sugar was not the issue that it had been before. So when freedom was granted in 1834, what we're talking about is a reformed British Parliament acting by order in council in Britain, very often against the wishes of what the local assemblies in the islands wanted. And of course, the only way in which they were going to acquiesce to this was the compensation. Now, in some of our islands, it is extremely embarrassing to read those, the parliamentary papers related to compensation. You can go through them. There's a wonderful copy at the library at Cave Hill. I did a television program, it hasn't been aired yet in Barbados, about it. I don't quite know the delay. I think they're a little frightened of what I did. But I went through the compensation lists, and I showed the thousands of pounds that slaveholders were given and what they did with those thousands of pounds. Same thing here in St. Lucia, in Dominica. You have them all. You can see how much was earned, and you can imagine where that money was reinvested, whether in new machinery or to pay off debts or whatever. But what is the embarrassing part, of course, is that the family names that you see in these compensation lists are still here with us today. So often we do not talk too much about these things. And the other thing is that in researching this book that I have just brought out, I'm going to do a little plug for myself. You can look on Amazon. It's called In the Forests of Freedom. It's about the Maroons of Dominica, but it relates to the Maroon story across the region. It is interesting to see how the planters use quotes from the Bible to justify slavery. In fact, one particular planter had a whole raft of quotes that he would pull out at any time in the House of Assembly when necessary. I had a few of them here just for information. You know, planters produced and quoted legal and religious books to justify the power that they seized in this colonial society. For we must be frank about this. The Judaic-Christian Bible was just as much a tool of colonization and control as were the draconian laws, the land titles, and the maps of appropriation and possession. Our legislatures and houses of assembly echoed with biblical quotations plucked from the Old and the New Testaments to justify the institution of enslavement. The most favored passages used by the planter legislatures was Leviticus chapter 25, verses 44 to 46, and I quote, "Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you, and from them you may buy slaves, and they will become your property. You can will them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life," unquote. That was a great favored one in Dominica. In exhorting their human property to accept their state in life, they turned to the passages such as Peter chapter 2, verse 18. I quote, "Slaves, submit to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh," unquote. When they were debating the Amelioration Acts in 1820s aimed at reducing some of the excessive abuses of the system, they turned in their defense to Exodus 21, verses 20 to 21. Quote, "If a man beats his male or female slave with a rod, and the slave dies as a direct result, he must be punished. But he is not to be punished if the slave gets up after a day or two, since the slave is his property," unquote. It is fitting to note that as the tide of slavery began to swell, other verses from that same Bible were used by the anti-slavery movement, Methodists and Moravians prominent among them, to ask, "Am I not a man and a brother?" So it was essentially a book for all seasons. And I'm very glad, too, that nobody has had the idea of going and so-called cleaning up the Bible, because it would be a pity if they removed all these offensive texts. I think it's honest that it is still there. So let us understand the merger that was going on at that time and the importance, and I'm going to deal with it a little later as well, because it formulates the mindset, the character of our Eastern Caribbean and Caribbean people in a broader sense as well. And that is when we enter the stagnant century, okay? That is the post-colonial period. And as I have written in this book, and I made a big speech in Dominica when we were unveiling our Meg Mahon Emancipation Statue. It stands in the middle of Roseau. I don't know whether you all have one yet, but I think it's about time you all have one. All right. It is remarkable when you reflect at what this region has achieved, when so many of our people started out with nothing. As I have written in my book on the Maroons of Dominica, this must be taken into account when considering OECS society of today. For when seen in that light, it is remarkable what has been achieved in areas such as education, home and land ownership, and self-government, given that the majority of our ancestors started off with nothing. When the liberated laborers of these islands pushed open the rough wooden shutters and doors of their huts to let the sunlight in on that new day of the 1st of August, 1838, they possessed nothing. Not even the huts were their own, much less for the land on which they stood. The new Lieutenant Governor of Dominica, John Longley, had made this clear some days before when he read out the Declaration of Emancipation on the steps of the courthouse and House of Assembly in Roseau. Its message was the same in all the colonies, and I quote, "Now let me tell you what the law has ordered for you, now that you are free men. You may remain in the houses and on the estates where you are until the 1st of October, if you wish to do so. The houses in which you live and the grounds which you have planted are not yours. They are not yours. But if you continue to work by agreements with your master and work as laborers work in England and all the other free countries cheerfully and diligently for your employer, he will let you live in his house and plant your provisions on his ground. That is what I advise you to do, what I know the Queen would wish you to do." So these are the kinds of statements that were made on emancipation, because essentially for that century, the idea was that life would continue, and that was the big problem which built up, and the pressure cooker up until in the 1930s, was that the attempt to maintain the plantation control of labor. And it essentially stagnated the society. Life did not essentially change for free people because of the fact that labor was the key factor. And we know in some cases, a little less here in St. Lucia, some in St. Vincent, some in Grenada, but not in the other islands, the introduction of indentured labor to compensate, to have that labor available at all times, and the conditions and the pay under which that labor lived. So you had this raft of legislation that came out after 1838, mainly from 1840, for the management of the newly emancipated citizens, because before that time, individual planters were in charge of discipline and control. But all of a sudden, the colonies were in charge of controlling this vast new liberated citizenry. And we have there in our books these vagrancy acts. Now the vagrancy acts, if I was a law student, it's a very interesting subject to do, because the vagrancy acts cover such a wide range of things, including way down to your sexuality. I mean, all these homosexual laws they complain now come under those vagrancy acts from the 1860s and whatever. The French, of course, never had them. The Spanish didn't. And, of course, in 2002, they abolished them in Montserrat and the Virgin Islands. And so these places haven't become sudden dens of iniquity. But the point of the matter is that that is where these laws originate from. We also, and I must say that St. Lucia, amazingly, is one of the few, apart from Barbados, that has abolished the Obeah Acts. We in Dominica still have on our books Obeah Acts from 1788, right? No, in hearts rather than acts. St. Lucia rather bravely in 1998 abolished the Obeah laws. Now, the Obeah laws, of course, were a de-Africanization of the people. It was essentially to wipe out any traits of African heritage and past that there were. So it is no surprise that in our villages, and so we are only now recreating our art, recreating our carving. Because in those laws, to possess what is called an instrument of obeah is a crime. And in the early days, you could be executed for this. In fact, the law in Dominica still says that if you write about obeah, you will be fined $3,000 or 3 months in jail. Well, I've written quite a lot about it. And I'm waiting for them to come and arrest me so we can have a grand cause célèbre, you know. But there again, we are fearful of this because it's something else that I'm going to come to with religion, is this balance between the politicians and the pastors, which I will be talking about a little later. Now, Stanley French wrote a play back in 1962 called The Rape of Fair Helen. I acted in that play. I played the priest. Unfortunately, in drama that I have been involved with, I'm always typecast. I'm either the priest, the governor, or the wicked planter. So what, I can't escape. So in Rape of Fair Helen, I was the priest. And this little girl comes, and I will not give you the whole rundown of the play, but it was a very significant play by this St. Lucian playwright, Stanley French. So these vagrancy acts still burden us today. And although we go and have legislative reviews and all this, very often these things are not picked up and removed. And as I said in a speech in Roseau at the unveiling of this monument, that we should have done like Nelson Mandela. And when we went and got our independence, we could have swept the slate clean of all these 18th century pieces of legislation and started afresh. That is what he did in South Africa. But we did not do that, and therefore we have all these little leftover pieces stuck in our legislation. But in spite of all of this, this independent peasantry emerged. Small farmers, tradesmen, vendors, hucksters emerged. The location of free villages by one means or another, mountain gardens, squatter settlements, slums on the edge of town. This was the beginning of the societies that we live in today. And in fact, from a physical planning point of view, it has made things very difficult for us. When you, like in Dominica, you go to any of our islands, particularly in the Windward Islands, where you had the Queen's 3 chains, and the houses are crowded into that 66 yards in Aslare, in Canary, in Maho, in Dominica, in Massac, in all of these villages. This is a result, a modern physical planning problem that has emerged in the post-emancipation era in our islands. We live with our history. And that is the point I want to make tonight, is that we live with our history day in, day out. And then the other thing that was conceived was loyalty to Queen and Empire. Particularly, as the governor said, it is important to cultivate this among the laboring classes. The Queen Empress Victoria. Now, very often the working people heard Victoria Regina, so they thought her surname was Regina. And that's why in Barbados they have a wonderful folk song, Hip Hip for Gin Gin, because, you know, Regina, so they just shortened it to Gin Gin. Hooray for Gin Gin. And importantly, 24th of May was her birthday. And so generations of OECS citizens, if they were old enough to be still alive, or even if they have passed on, celebrated the 24th of May as Empire Day. You got a school holiday, and you went and you ran races, and you were given bread and Coke or lemonade. So these things are still with us today, but they have changed, because the marching and all that of Empire Day has now been transformed, reimagined into the marching and the parades of our national events and festivals. And now I come to the scramble for souls. This was also a policy of British government control after emancipation. They really did have a challenge because all of a sudden, here were these thousands of people up and down the islands that basically had to be controlled in one way or another, benign or otherwise. And so, Bishop Coleridge was sent out by the Church of England to move up and down the islands to work out the imposition, the development of the Church of England in all of our states. And there's a wonderful book written by his nephew, 6 Months in the West Indies. His nephew is his secretary, and he goes to places like St. Lucia and Barbados. He establishes himself, and they write, "A religious and moral spirit may be excited in the slaves." Remember, it's 1825, they're still slaves, but they know emancipation from a British point of view is coming. "A religious and moral spirit may be excited in the slaves, and a peaceable subordination of the whole class ensured." A peaceable subordination of the whole class will be ensured. I leave that there. Education, guided by basic needs. And you know, although I'm just explaining the reality of the situation, this is not to deny the valuable work that the church eventually did in terms of education that the colonies could not afford. Because in those days, you had, except when you got the Miko charity or whatever giving you funds, the colony had to raise its own money to run its own affairs. And if you didn't make that money, you simply did not have the services required, be it education or health or otherwise. So the church did, in fact, do a great deal. And so here the colonial office sends out a circular to governors. Full emancipation has not even been achieved yet in 1835. The great mass of the people have just emerged from slavery, but have not yet acquired any acquaintance with the principles and precepts of Christianity, and are for the most part destitute of the first elements of learning. And so essentially what we get is the three major churches, Methodist, Anglican, Roman Catholic, involved with the state in ensuring, one, the peace of the community, and also education and other services. That is why the bishop always sat on the right hand of the governor at official occasions, and the British government would make great concessions to the Roman Catholic Church in places like St. Lucia, Dominica, Grenada, because of the important role the church was playing in this. This was going to happen again during the Cold War, after the Second World War, when the United States evangelicals, fundamentalist evangelicals, came down from the Midwest Bible Belt. Their missionaries came down after the Second World War and flooded our islands. Because, and these are in the papers related to the CIA and others, the important role they played in keeping the societies calm, conservative, and peaceful. And so all of these faith fundamentalist evangelicals came through the islands and established themselves, and then the missionaries passed on the responsibilities to local pastors, local clergy, and we see today the hold which the fundamentalist thought has on us. So that sometimes even people in disaster management have to try to explain to people that, you know, hurricanes and earthquakes are natural events and they are not sent to punish you. Because, you know, I mean, it is not just today. Back in 1902, when 30,000 people were killed north of us in Martinique at Saint-Pierre, the eruption of Montagne Pelée, and the ship came in here. It was the first ship that escaped from Saint-Pierre, and it arrived in the Castries harbor still smoking and burning, and they told them of the destruction of Saint-Pierre. All through Castries, immediately they said, "Ha, vous voyez ça? Bon Dieu, bon pour you." Because they had a theater, they had plays, the women were too beautiful. All these peculiar things were brought up to say that they were destroyed by the volcano, because of their behavior. So we must understand that these things are very much still evident within us. The other thing that had to be done was essentially to remove the elected element within our islands. Now, St. Lucia didn't have that problem because from the time the British took them over in 1814, they were a crown colony. They had no elected representative. They had a nominated legislature. So as the governor said, it was easy to handle things in St. Lucia. You just got your nominated legislature to pass. In some of the other islands, like Dominica and Antigua, and so there was more trouble. And Grenada and Dominica particularly, where there was this so-called mulatto ascendancy, there was a move by the British government to remove the elected element. And eventually, in Dominica, was the last. It was achieved in 1898. And pure crown colony rule was established, and up and down our OECS, there were no elections in place, that you would not have any elected representative. Now, the importance of men of literature, the importance of intellectuals in influencing the British government is seen in the visit of James Anthony Froude, who writes this book, The English in the West Indies, or The Bow of Ulysses. He says that the British had just abandoned the islands of the West, the colonies of the West Indies, and he urges that they be picked up again. He said they've abandoned the colonies, new investments must be encouraged, there must be new men and new energy, but these were to be British and British energy, because you cannot entrust the government to local leaders. You see, he was also referring, because he was a great anti-home rule man related to Ireland. And the same way he did not want Ireland to have home rule and be managed by the Irish, he also did not want the new intelligentsia of the islands to control these islands. As in Ireland, no home rule. Well, he was rebutted by a very feisty Trinidadian called J.J. Thomas, who wrote a rebuttal called Fraudacity, and which he blasts all of Froude's. But you see, Froude was such an influential writer in Britain at the time that administrators and governors in these islands followed his advice into the 1890s and early 20th century. Without a voice in Parliament, what emerged in these islands was a very vociferous press, usually run by educated free men of color. And I think the Voice newspaper of St. Lucia is one of the oldest of these publications in any of our islands. And it was these newspapers exchanging news from Grenada going up. Dominica had the Dominican, Grenada had the West Indian, and the Voice here in St. Lucia and others. The newspapers were extremely influential in this. And then we move into the 20th century and we get the foundations of nationalism. I mentioned in the introduction to this talk the way in which the First World War really galvanized people, because those men who went with all the spirit of empire and contributing, when they went up there in these terrible conditions, in the trenches and in Palestine and Egypt fighting, they saw the underbelly of empire. And those that survived, whose names are not written on the war memorials that are lined all our islands, the war memorial there in Walcott Square, etc. Those who returned realized that this empire they were talking about was not all that it was made out to be. And that a new nationalism emerged during that period. We have wonderful articles in the Voice and in the Grenada paper, the West Indian, under Marichaud at that time, coming out with these very nationalistic points of view. We are West Indians. And you begin to hear this for the first time after that First World War. And you get little demonstrations here and there, no taxation without representation. We need legislatures where we are represented. And so bit by bit, you had something called the Wood Report. A commissioner, Wood, came out and he did a commission of inquiry, and he said that some representation must be given. So in 1924, the vote was returned to places like Dominica and St. Vincent, and in St. Lucia, you had it for the first time. And interestingly, women over the age of 21 were also permitted to vote for the first time. Of course, at that time, you had to have qualifications of land or income to be able to vote. And then eventually in 1951, the right for all over 21 to vote without previous qualifications. 1956, ministerial government. 1967, internal self-government granted. And then eventually in the 70s and 80s, full political independence. And you had at the same time, we've heard a lot about Garvey. Now, Garvey was very important in spreading the word further afield, up in Jamaica and in the United States and in Britain. But we had our people here in the OECS who were very vociferous in talking about have the pride. You have to achieve the emancipation of the soul, which will eventually lead to that of economic and political emancipation, so essential to our advancement. And that is Theophilus Albert Marichaux. So this movement of nationalism, although it was a middle class nationalism, let us understand, but it was filtering across down into the working class. And then you have one of the most important things to have happened within these OECS islands in the 20th century. And this is the Dominica Conference. This is a conference that has not been organized by the British government. They have not solicited people. They are not putting it in place. These are West Indian nationalists who decide to gather together in Roseau, Dominica, to chart a new way for the West Indies. And in here are all of the heroes. You have Manchester, you have Duncan of St. Vincent, Manchester of St. Kitts, and Gordon of St. Lucia. He's there sitting in the front next to Cipriani. They're inviting Cipriani from Trinidad because Cipriani had become, having come from the First World War, such an outspoken voice for self-government in the islands. And so at this Dominica Conference, they begin to chart a new perception of Caribbean leadership. And they advocate self-government. But you will note that Marichaux is not in that group. Marichaux refused to attend that meeting because they could not agree, that group could not agree on universal suffrage. And he said there is no sense in all the wonderful ideas you have for the future of the West Indies if you do not include the right to vote over 21 without qualifications for everyone. Let us understand these were middle class radicals. They were still imbued with the spirit of empire, and many people, including Uriah Buzz Butler and others in Trinidad, they were West Indian radicals but empire loyalists. You must understand how strong this thing was, that it was done within the concept of empire. And these were all empire loyalists. And there was nothing really at the time wrong in that, because in history you always have to see people within their time. And these people must be seen within their time, whether it's Gordon or Duncan or Manchester or CEA Rawle of Dominica and the others who are represented there. But events took over that middle class, and almost immediately after the conference was over, riots, strikes, demonstrations up and down the islands. Right here, the women who were carrying coal on the waterfront here to fill into the steamships, people in St. Vincent, Grenada, up in St. Kitts, sugar workers, they all revolted and demanded a better life for themselves. This was not a blind, as it was described by one governor, this was not a blind protest. This was a demand for a better life. And it is out of that labor movement, out of that uprising of the 30s, that we get the politicians that then emerge, very young men at that time, that then emerge into the 50s with universal suffrage to become the mid-20th century leaders of the West Indies. People like Bradshaw and Gary and the others, Joshua, for instance. And then, as a result of all of this tumult in the islands, the British government realizes that something must be done. They send warships, they kill people, the police come out and shoot, and this is not the way to solve the issue. And so they get this guy, Chairman Lord Moyne. Poor Lord Moyne. I'll tell you why I say I'm sad for Lord Moyne. Because Lord Moyne and his team produced this amazing report. The report is so stunning that when he hands it into the British government in 1940, the war has broken out by then. And when they read it, the British government says, we can't publish this. The Nazis will use it as propaganda against us for the way that we treat our people. If they thought that the Jews were being treated bad, well, look how the people of the West Indies are being treated. Because Moyne and his team were very clear-headed. What is amazing is when you read the list, you read all the big planters of St. Lucia, Dominica, whatever, who are coming before him and telling them, oh, the people don't need any land. Oh, the land is so fertile, they can get yam, dasheen, and things so easily. 6 pence a day is quite enough for them and all that. But the commissioners don't take that at face value, and they recommend a whole raft of things which eventually turn in their recommendations to change the life of Caribbean people. Lord Moyne does such a successful job in the West Indies that he is sent to solve the issues of Palestine in the 1940s. And poor Lord Moyne gets blown up by the Haganah outside the St. David Hotel in Jerusalem. But his name lives on in the British West Indies for the things that he did. Everything from regional air travel, schools, clinics, healthcare, votes, the whole range of things that we benefited from in the 50s and 60s comes from that Moyne Commission. A new phase emerges in the 1940s, and the US has bases here in St. Lucia, in Antigua, and in other territories, and the US influence becomes very much stronger here. As Britain after the war is weakened and increasingly is turning to Europe, what is happening here is the influence of the United States is getting stronger and stronger, and it is having an important impact on the social lives and the perceptions of the people of these islands. So now we get the United States influence. I mentioned already about the US religious influence that was also coming in after the war. And then we also had emigration, because the solutions that Moyne and them had hoped for were not transferring to the population quick enough to give them jobs. And Britain was rebuilding itself and needed workers. It needed people in the new National Health Service, on the railways and buildings, and encouraged people to go to England to work. And so essentially, this is what happened. And we know in the 50s, the big ships that would come and take people to England, and it was the beginning of the creation of a diaspora and its effects in the 21st century. So when we're dealing with St. Lucians or Vincentians or whatever, we're always now having to think of the thousands that are in other parts of the world, mainly in Britain and in North America. And so the post-war, post-empire period. The war is over. What do we do with these islands? Basically, that's what Britain is saying. Well, you know, the 19th century was all very well. We sucked a little bit out of them, and we sucked a good bit out of them in the 18th century. But now we have other things on our mind. How do we pack these islands together and create some sort of political entity that they will take care of themselves? And so they pushed through the Federation of the West Indies. All are we is one. That's the theme. And it was a noble experiment. But I think it bit off more than it could chew. If in 1932 they had formulated a sub-regional grouping, the Windwards and the Leewards, they probably could have been able to survive. But they took on Jamaica, they took on Trinidad. And There were elections in 1958, and this is the Federal Parliament of 1959. And this is a lesson. So this is a lesson for all those people that go and say, oh, we're going to have political unity. Maybe some of them don't even know the history. Every one of those front benches, the cabinet, and many of the others who were in the back benches, they sacrificed their political future for the Federation of the West Indies. Because when those ministers of government came back to their islands, the carpet had been removed from out their feet, and all of them suffered political death on their return. You see Grantley Adams there. By the time he came back, Errol Barrow had taken over, formed a new party, and the Democratic Labour Party had moved. Phyllis Shand Allfrey, the only woman there in the cabinet from Dominica who founded the Labour Party, who got more votes than Leblanc, she was fired from her party. You had Karl Lacorbinier, the Deputy Prime Minister, and he also was removed. The only person who survived was wily Mr. Robert Bradshaw. Because who had Bradshaw left to take care of things in St. Kitts? Dominican-born Paul Southwell. And he knew that being Dominican-born, there is no way that Paul Southwell could have the masses turn against him. And so Bradshaw went back to St. Kitts, took over, and sailed into independence and beyond, and to the far beyond. But everybody who sacrificed themselves for that political unity suffered politically, and it was the death knell of their political lives. So when I hear leaders of the OECS talking boldly about political union, I don't think they have thought too deeply, or maybe they're just spouting words, because you are certainly, it's a great ideal, but you are sacrificing your small island entity for that bigger, greater good. And here is the Senate. They also had a Senate, and I've ringed around the red the two St. Lucians, who the president of the Senate was the Honorable A.M. Lewis, and then we have J.L. Charles is the other member. Here, the Senate, of course, was nominated, and usually they sent elderly people who, good citizens, and really and truly, this was not a controversial aspect. What was great about the Federation of the West Indies was some of the physical things that were put in place. The federal boats, the federal palm and the federal maple that linked the islands together. And once in the early 70s when they were disposed of, we have never had anything to replace them. I'm trying to encourage the OECS to buy a ship and replicate this so that Boy Scouts and Girl Guides and cricket teams can easily move between the islands, because you're not going to have any unity unless they're all going to visit each other and be with each other. One of the things that the Moyne Commission also mentioned, the Moyne Commission has 2 pages about a government-run airline. In 1938, 1940, the Moyne Commission is talking about this. And it is only thanks, the only person who ever did anything was the St. Vincent government, who had this little plane, the Grumman Goose, who kept the islands together and linked up to Barbados. And thanks to Frank DeLille on a field at Ulverston in Montserrat, creating with his one little Bonanza aircraft, the beginning of LIAT. And it is LIAT that we depend on today. I love it when LIAT lands in Dominica, and the air hostess gives you a beautiful welcome, and she says, "Thanks for choosing LIAT." Well, we have no choice. I mean, yeah. So, the problems of the Moyne Commission live on. The problems that the Moyne Commission found in these islands live on. Then, by the time the Federation was over, and by the time they were searching for new ways, essentially, there was this big thing in the North, which affected our lives for the rest of the 20th century. And that was the Cuban Revolution. I will not go into detail, but all of a sudden, we became the midst of the power play in the Cold War. So here was the United States government, and the British government, and the French government to a certain extent, wary of the leaderships that were emerging within our islands of what became the OECS, that we were not going to shake up this loyalty to Western capitalism, to the United States. And so great attention was paid to us. Great attention was paid to us until, of course, the Berlin Wall fell, communism collapsed, and then they really couldn't care what happened to us at all, more or less. I'm exaggerating a bit. But the fact of the matter is that ghost of the Cuban Revolution really hung over us for the rest of the 20th century. And then we have the real noble failure. This effort to try to pick up the pieces. Okay, Eric Williams, after they had the referendum in Jamaica, and they decided to leave the Federation, and Eric Williams says this wonderful thing, 1 from 10 leaves nothing, right? 1 from 10 leaves 0. But there were 8 little ones, and the 8 little ones, for a time, tried to do something. Barrow really took a political risk, and he told them when they were squabbling, V.C. Byrd, I have talked and interviewed to people who have since died, and they were part of those conferences, and they said, you know, like V.C. Byrd is worrying where the money from the post office is going to go. Like, you know, are we going to all share the same post office and stuff like that? And Barrow comes and says, look, it's 1965, going on 66. I am taking a political risk to create this union. I have a place in St. Lucie, the old base at Harrison's, which could be the headquarters of the Little Eight, of the new Eastern Caribbean Union. But, you know, I am under political pressure, and if you all don't decide soon, I will have to go independent. And that's exactly what he had to do. And so the Little Eight fell apart, and bless his heart, Sir Arthur Lewis, who wrote the little booklet on the agony of the Eight, he tried his best to ensure. And if that had happened, we would have had the OECS 20 years before its time, you know? But that was one time we missed. And so, once again, the British government said, what do we do with all these little bits? And they got together at Lancaster House in London, and they conceived associated statehood. Well, they looked at Puerto Rico and they said, well, maybe we can fiddle together some kind of constitution. We can invent some kind of constitution. And they created associated statehood. They granted internal self-government. Everything we received at that time, 80% of our independence. So when we had our big independence ceremonies in 1978, 1979, really, we were 80% independent already. And all we were cutting was the umbilical cord of defense and foreign affairs. And we had our own little flags. And that is the tragedy of the Little Eight. Because once the Little Eight failed, we became mini nation states. And the whole concept of regionalism, the imagined community of the region, fell apart. My first job after I left school was a reporter for WIBS, Windward Islands Broadcasting Service. In the middle of the day, there was news from Grenada, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Dominica. Everybody heard everybody else's news. And then WIBS ran out of the True Blue down in Grenada. As soon as we got associated statehood, everybody wanted their own radio station. Radio St. Lucia, Radio Dominica, Radio Grenada. Gary took all our equipment, and we had to scrounge around individually. You all had your masts at Babino, we had our masts at Hillsborough. I was there. We pieced it all together and created our independent. We had our flags, we had our anthems, we had our little coats of arms. So that window of opportunity with the Little Eight was smashed. And we formed our new flags. St. Lucia had this wonderful flag, along with the Barbadian flag. I find St. Lucia's is one of the most creative indeed. Simple, straightforward. As they say, you can draw it, a child can draw it in the sand. Rather rashly, St. Kitts, Nevis, and Anguilla decided to have a palm tree with 3 branches. But very shortly afterwards, there was the Anguilla crisis and one of the branches fell off. So, whereas St. Lucia and Antigua, and to a certain extent St. Vincent, could go independent with the flags they had as associated statehood, Dominica, Grenada decided to create another flag. Eric Gary told Patrick John, let me tell you, when you have a flag, you must put stars on it. That's good luck. So we put stars on ours as well. But you had the Anguilla crisis, and Anguilla broke out. I won't go into too much detail on that. And so we see that the union now also has bits and pieces falling off at the edges, as the very small bits that could not go independent as a union, the British government was then faced with, what do we do with Montserrat? What do we do with Anguilla, Turks and Caicos, Cayman? And of course we know now that they are British overseas territories, and we see the crisis that Britain is going through after Hurricane Irma, and that is on the front burner of British news now. What do we do with these little pink bits that are left over? What also happened after statehood was that Mr. Forbes Burnham decided to get in on the act, the Prime Minister and later President of Guyana. And he attempted in 1971 to create another union. And they met in Grenada. They issued the Grenada Declaration 1971. St. Lucia was not involved, and John Compton said that that union is a union between sardines and a shark. And he probably was very true indeed, because Burnham had his eyes on the islands and control from a point of view of trade and political influence and otherwise. Anyway, he went on to other things, and he created his cooperative republic. And so, here we were, associated states, all with our own constitutions, and we had these little clauses in that we could move out at any time, either referendum or by a vote in the British Parliament. And so, from 1974 with Grenada, where they held the most peculiar Independence Night, because it was all under, almost, under the pressure of political influence and problems that had happened at the time, going right through to the famous photograph, now the statue of Compton raising the Constitution, through into Dominica, which was the only island in the Eastern Caribbean, or should I say, the only island in the Commonwealth Caribbean to become a republic directly on independence. And I will tell you how that happened, because I was involved. And so what happened is then all these associated states, bit by bit, then became independent nation states. And that also was a tragedy, because, in London we shared a common office, and that broke up. And now we can't even agree on foreign affairs. It would be good if the OECS could take responsibility for foreign affairs, but they can't, because all the ones who are saints recognize Taiwan, and all the ones who are not saints recognize mainland China. So you can't, and some tied in with Venezuela, and now we have the freedom of movement, so our leaders can go to the ends of the earth, Azerbaijan and Iran, and beg for things that we need. So you will now have a floating foreign affairs where each leader is trying their best to outdo the other in getting assistance from the nation states, wherever they can find them, to be able, to sell passports and So in 1976, Patrick John announces that we are going to go independent, where Dominica is going to be the first after Grenada to go independent. And he hands all of us a constitution. And he says he'd like to go independent by 1977. And what is it? It is the standard monarchical constitution, and it basically is a few little rewritings of the 1967 constitution. Now, I was a member of the opposition. We only had 3 members in opposition. There we are at the side. there I am, Eugenia Charles, myself, and an elderly guy called Anthony Moise. But it's Eugenia Charles and myself that had to carry the load. Eugenia says, see that thing? You see that thing? I know what Patrick has up his sleeve. He is such a great friend of Forbes Burnham that he is going to go independent sweetly, as the British want, under the monarchical constitution. And then within 2 years, he's going to create himself executive president, and he's going to replicate the Guyana situation in Dominica. So I am going to go for a republic. So we go for a republic. She also demanded that there not be two houses, Senate and the House of Assembly, that it be a unicameral chamber. And by this time, Patrick had lost the year, and he desperately wanted his independence. And so he said, everything Eugenia said, he said yes. So you can have your electoral commission, because under the draft constitution, the Governor General was going to supervise, be charged of supervising the elections officer, etc., and general elections. And so we became a republic. But we could not call ourselves the Republic of Dominica, because we would get even further confused with the Dominican Republic. So we concocted this name, the Commonwealth of Dominica. And even so, a lot of our mail gets come to us stamped Mal Encaminado a Santo Domingo, you know. But the point of the matter is, the process of getting this independence was very interesting, because, and this was something that was characteristic of those times, we had no voice on the national radio station, and none of these little FM stations had been permitted to be formed. So we had the advantage, although we thought at the time it was a disadvantage. We had to go around the countryside in a little pickup and talk to the people about independence. I produced a little book called Think It Over. Patrick John tore it up in the House of Assembly. Oh, well, it's very distinguished, you know, when you have a book and it's torn up in the House of Assembly. So anyway, he tore it up, and we went around the country, and they said we were against independence. All we wanted to do was to ensure that everybody understood that's this new constitution. And so we became independent. But there was another interesting little twist which takes us back to the first period that I talked about in this talk, and that is the existence of the Kalinago people. And the Kalinago people in Dominica demanded that there be a special law passed for them, or else they would oppose independence. They were going to be against independence, because they said, we made an arrangement with the British in 1903 to have a territory, to have a chief, and we want it written in law that we continue to have those privileges. And so the Kalinago Territory Act exists: chief, council, parliamentary representative, Ministry of Kalinago Affairs, Minister of Kalinago Affairs. We are very different in that regard. And so the Kalinagos now have an entity unto themselves, and it is working very, very well indeed, because the young Kalinagos, Hilary Beckles ensured that they had scholarships, and it's amazing what is coming out of the Kalinago territory now. A re-energized identity. Once again, imagined community, invented tradition. And this is a very powerful move that's happening there in the territory, thanks to this demand at independence that they receive special legislation. And then you had the peculiar situation of St. Vincent, where the opposition didn't even go to the Constitutional Conference. Mitchell did not go for political reasons, refused to go, and he didn't even attend the flag raising in Kingstown. And so Cato, who was the prime minister, sped through. And so we have the emergence at that time, the reinforcing of that separatism, the reinforcing of those emblems, and the identity related to our individual island states. And we realized after a few years, not many, because we had done most of this in the 70s, and when the OECS was initiated in June of 1981, neither Antigua nor St. Kitts Nevis had yet become independent. But it was realized that really we needed each other, and we had to formulate. And so we tried regionalism again. and the famous photograph on the steps of the government headquarters in Bastia. Famous for something that's going to happen in a few years. Maurice Bishop decides to come and link up. And in many, I've understood that this, for him, was the beginning of the end of his relationship with Cord. Because Cord did not want these links to take place. Cord had his textbook ideals for some sort of Trotskyist state of Grenada. And Bishop wanted to create these links with the region because what had happened in Grenada, I won't go into it now, was essentially, yes, we had statehood, yes, we had independence, but that these constitutions that we had were not going to satisfactorily cope with the needs and the requirements of our island people. And this was what that revolution in its essence was about, that a new system had to be formed to be able to create a new type of nation state that was more amenable to the needs of the people. And of course, the particular characteristics of the Eric Gary governments, although like many of the working class leaders of the time, he was clearly identified with changing the life of the barefooted man, as they said at the time. And so that OECS emerged and has gone from strength to strength. So we have been also fortunate because we have had certain regional things in place with the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, which is great because we have 7 finance ministers, 7 financial secretaries who have to agree on our currencies and financial good health. We are not like Barbados, where government can just say print money. So we have to have a larger agreement, and we have a better balance, and therefore we have a reasonably strong currency thanks to that. The Supreme Court, of course, we already had under statehood, and then the inter-island ministerial meetings on various matters of mutual concern, which had met since statehood. And then the OECS developed other very, very important things, such as the pharmaceutical purchase of bulk pharmaceutical, which, you know, that's an ideal example of what unity can bring to the needs of our people, particularly those we know hypertension and diabetes and the need for constant medication throughout our region in every village and community. So it is a very important thing. And 25 years later, we raised this flag. Now, I'm an artist. It is one of the most complicated flags on the planet. And it looks like it was designed by a computer or with a computer. It is nothing like St. Lucia's flag or Barbados flag that a child can draw in the sand. I wish they had used a primary green. It would not look so puce. But the fact of the matter is, it is our flag. Fine. But as I say, when from a design point of view, really and truly, it could have been a touch simpler with all these faded colors and whatever else. But at least these are these kinds of symbols that I'm talking about, which Anderson and Eric Hobsbawm talks about. I will quickly go through what has happened within our region. In spite of the fact that you have legal frameworks linking islands together, but there is only naturally going to be personal connections which emerge. And during the 1980s and early 1990s, these were the 3 dominant persons within the OECS. The fact that Eugenia Charles, Mitchell, and Compton would be on the phone to each other all the time, influence other leaders within the OECS to take decisions which were for the benefit of the region. And then, of course, they were highly influential in the OECS initiative with the invasion of Grenada. But that is another lecture. They even got together in bath suits on the beach in Mustique. Yep. When Guyana was having problems with our islands and there was problems with trade, Mitchell said, why don't we all go down to Mustique and have a day, relax, go on the beach, and try to solve this regional issue. And so they did. Miss Charles's bath suit that she went into the House of Assembly in Dominica. I will quickly tell this story because it's wonderful. In 1971, July, we passed a National Dress Act. National Dress Act is that you can go into court, House of Assembly, whatever, with a shirt jack. But the law, the clauses say the shirt jack must cover your hips, and it must be of a certain color, etc. So Miss Charles went into the House of Assembly in her legal robe, black legal robe, and when the reading of the bill came up, she stood up and she took off the robe, and she was in her bath suit. And she said, Mr. Speaker, I am glad to see that this piece of legislation only applies to men, because nobody is going to tell me, a woman, how I must dress to come to the House of Assembly. Anyway, the law is still with us. And these linkages that happen behind the scenes also we don't know about. You see, sometimes you say, oh, Eugenia Charles, she was a great Grenadier. Eugenia Charles had very strong links with Grenada, but she did not like the way she was a leader for the rule of law. And she really had known what she had gone through in relation to the Constitution, the Independence Constitution. And she kept close tabs. She tried to influence Bishop a great deal. The week before he was killed, she tried to persuade Unison Whiteman not to go back to Grenada. He said, I must go back with my brothers. She said, you will be killed. You will be killed. The way I see things happening there with Cord, something's going to blow, and you will be killed. And sure enough, that is what happened to him. And for the OECS, you know, this space, you have to really go there into the courtyard at Fort George, and you have to look at that wall, and you have to think, to put members of cabinet against a wall and to shoot them with these powerful weapons. And although there is a plaque listing the names of people who died that day on the 19th of October 1983, you have to look at the hollow cast iron basketball pole to see the power of those bullets through that pole. This is not the way to change governments in the OECS. And this is exactly what Eugenia Charles and the others, Compton, Mitchell, and the rest, said. And this is why they took the action that they did. They did not end a revolution because essentially the revolution had ended itself. It had committed suicide. How was Cord going to run this country, I wondered? How was he and his men going to run this country when for the first time in the history of Grenada, nobody had been to church on a Sunday because they were all locked in their houses? How the freeness, the heritage of our islands going to be commanded by this kind of doctrinaire attitude? So sometimes people say, oh, Eugenia Charles, she was responsible for the US invasion. But how were the OECS members going to deal with it? Were they going to arrive in Grenada and have a discussion with Cord? And they didn't know where the bodies of Bishop and Kreft and Unison Whiteman and the others were. You know, it is going to be a continual discussion, and there are those people who think that she was wrong. But that picture over there on the right always perplexes me, and she has never answered the question. That photograph was taken in September of 1983. She is invited on to the USS Independence, which is having war games off Puerto Rico. Arrives on a helicopter and inspects and talks to the captain and all the officers responsible. And within a month, those same ships are approaching Grenada. How much did she know? Did they know that something was going to break in Grenada and they were practicing to be prepared? All of these are mysterious aspects that remain. And the whole story of Grenada and the role of the OECS within it is something I think that scholars and political scientists will debate maybe for the rest of time. but it is an interesting case. And then those same leaders, particularly Mitchell, he was a prime mover of this, decided that even within the OECS, we could create this political union within the Windward Islands, because culturally and all, we were so close together. But it was a short-lived attempt, and in spite of the fanfare on each of the 4 islands, it really got nowhere. And then many governments looked at their constitutions, their independence constitutions, and they had independence constitutional review commissions. In the case of Grenada, in the case of St. Vincent, in the case of Dominica. Now, what happened with Grenada and St. Vincent is they decided to have referendums. Referendums are always dangerous things because people judge it by who's in power, not by what's on the papers, and not the long-term view. And so, in all the cases, even in Dominica, with our 2 constitutional reviews, nothing really has changed. And so the challenges that we have to end of being small island states in a globalized and neoliberal world. I talked already about neoliberalism and the effect that it's having on our governments, desperate to deliver and therefore desperate to make deals, to engage in the selling of passports, and all that implies. It is a very delicate balance to pursue. Trying to achieve results in the face of declining financial resources and minimal exports. Somebody from the Commonwealth Secretariat had a wonderful paper recently about the way that exports have declined in the OECS and in our islands, certainly. The attempt to provide development opportunities in conjunction with the demands of investors. Investors come and they demand. They want this piece of land. They want to do X, they want to do Y, they don't want anybody on the beaches. And you as a leader have to run this gauntlet of considering the quality of life for the people. And pursuing these goals while at the same time subject to natural disasters, as we have seen. And you never know, there's a few coming off Africa now that could still affect us for the rest of the hurricane season. And so I suggest, because of all that we have been through, I am looking around to another part of the world that has gone through these rather similar experiences to us, and I touched on Ireland. Ireland has been through a terrible history. The Irish have been put upon, they have been discriminated against, they have been oppressed by the British government to a great extent. And yet, they, from the 1970s, because of, once again, an invention of tradition, a new perception of themselves and their role in the world, perhaps we should look at the Irish model and see how we can adapt it to ourselves. But we cannot adopt the Irish model if we remain bigoted and narrow-minded and not open to the world. And yet at the same time, we have to create that balance again of ensuring that we do not bend over backwards and sacrifice so much of our islands to the demands of people who are the so-called investors. This is the careful balance that we have to play. And yet, there is hope. I see a growing network of young people, most of them in their 20s. They're tied in with the new technology. They are at link with the big wide world. They flip all kinds of bits and instruments. You have a problem with your laptop or your tablet, and you can hand it to them and they'll cure it in a minute. They are innovative, and they are emerging with a new confidence. They're armed with new technologies that free them from the strictures of an insular existence, dominated by traditional, bigoted, and narrow-minded perceptions, particularly in relation to our bureaucracies, these amazing bureaucracies that we've developed. We have developed these bureaucratic bourgeoisies that just don't want to move. And this is a major problem that we have, because once again, the assurance of jobs, the assurance of stability. But it's a vicious circle, because you're not going to move unless those bureaucracies are willing to shift. And this is exactly what we need at this time in relation to these young people. A cadre of young, innovative people with a spirit of confidence, enterprising, outgoing young people, aware of, but not burdened by their past. So this evening, what I've attempted to do is to make us aware of this past, but not create it as a burden. Be aware of it, of why we are the way we are, of why our states are the way they are, in relation to the OECS, in relation to the University of the West Indies. And here, my final plug is a disturbing thing which is happening in our islands. As we become more introverted, more insular, this one last vestige of regionalism, all the way from Belize through Jamaica, right down to Trinidad and across the islands of the University of the West Indies, begun in 1948, boosted throughout the Federation, is being challenged by these very governments because they are not paying their dues. I am on the University Open Campus Council. Most of the islands in the OECS are owing in the tune of $8 million to the universities. I know that in the case of St. Lucia, I must say that the government is making an arrangement of payment in tranches to try to relieve the situation, and some other governments are doing this. But here is one amazing regional body, and you are trying to develop individual island entities so that you can say we have our own university. What is the quality of that university going to be? Where are you going to get your professors and your, you know, the whole feel of being a university student on a regional level if you are going to limit it to your simple island state? Yes, it gives you political kudos. Yes, you may feel that, you know, there is some status involved and some links that could be created. But when you cannot even maintain some of the buildings of your state colleges, when you cannot even pay staff regularly, and I'm across the board. I'm not talking about St. Lucia. I'm talking, and that's the wonderful thing about being a regional person. You are talking about all, right? So the point of the matter is, let us hold on and let us take pride and let us support the regional entities that we have that are part of our heritage while we build an even stronger region, because the similarities we have are greater than our differences. Thank you all very much. Good night.
I would like to thank all those who have made this event possible. I think special mention should be made of Dr. Justin Robinson, Professor Eudine Barreto, Dr. Liz Longsworth, Dr. Francis Severin, Dr. Wendy Grenade, the chairperson for the committee, members of the Open Campus, University of the West Indies, and members of the University of the West Indies Cave campus, Miss Cynthia Barrow-Giles, our chairperson for this afternoon. Also, we'd like to thank Paul Gibbs, who designed the wonderful banner that we are displaying here tonight. We would like to thank Dr. Veronica Simon, and the members of staff of the University of the West Indies Open Campus St. Lucia, who worked very hard to ensure that this evening's proceedings were successful. To the persons who performed lovely tonight, members of the JLN Band and Kendall Hippolyte, we say a special thank you. To a caterer, who we are going to enjoy some lovely gifts from in a moment, we also say thank you to you. We would like to thank the members of the media, and special mention to the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for your support in making this event possible. To the man of the night and our esteemed guest, Dr. Lennox Honychurch, we would like to say a special thank you to you for traveling all the way from Dominica to present such an insightful and inspirational lecture. I know that we have all gleaned from what was presented tonight, and I can say that I have personally learned quite a bit from what was presented as a student of the Open Campus and also as a citizen of the Eastern Caribbean.